All right, welcome to lesson 8 of the Reconstruction era. What we're going to do in this section is we're going to take a look at two African American leaders during this time and their different plans for helping these freed slaves. The first guy we're going to take a look at is Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington becomes head of the Normal and Industrial School at Tuskegee, Alabama. Now, industrial schools were meant to teach trades, mainly building and repairing machinery. The normal schools were teacher training schools, and so the normal and industrial school had two purposes: first, to teach teachers, and second, to teach industrial trades. He becomes head of the school in 1881 and started off with 40 students who literally built the school themselves. It was hands-on learning how to build buildings in architecture, and the school was meant to teach useful trades as a means towards self-respect and economic equality. These were not meant to be classical education, and by classical education we mean what it typically means today is liberal arts, but a classical education school would teach Latin, would teach Greek, would teach math, science, reading, writing, history, philosophy, those kinds of classes. Booker T. Washington in public said that, what blacks needed to do in the South was they needed to learn trades that would make the whites appreciate them. They needed to learn to do physical work so that way they could become economically equal. Once blacks had gained economic equality, then they could go on and gain political and social equality. But it was first important to make themselves valuable in society, and they would only do that through learning industrial trades. He encouraged blacks publicly to adopt middle-class white speaking. He encouraged them to learn middle-class white language. He encouraged them to adopt middle-class white dress. He wanted them to fit into white society. He did this publicly. Privately, he was very against Jim Crow laws and racial violence, and he would protect blacks from lynch mobs as much as he could, and wrote several coded letters that haven't come to light until recently. And so while he is trying to fight the social injustice, he's doing that privately. Publicly, he's saying that blacks need to fit into white society. If they try and fit into white society, they're going to be less prone to being victims of white violence, and eventually those racial differences would go away, but it was going to be a slow process. In 1896, we have the passage of a very important Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is going to determine African American life for the next almost 100 years until 1954. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, what the court was asked to decide was whether equal rights meant inclusion, or whether as long as things were by some semblance equal, then that would be equal rights for blacks. And so the court case centered around schools and the treatment of African Americans in the South at this time. The Supreme Court decides, in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, that being equal does not mean being together. And so as long as conditions were in some way equal between blacks and whites, they didn't have to be the same treatment. And so you could have separate schools as long as those schools were treated equally. You could have separate train stations and train cars as long as they were equal in some way. And so this was to prevent the mixing of races, but also to give more definition as to what equal rights meant. And so Plessy versus Ferguson says that separate but equal is okay. What will come about in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education is they will find that separate is not equal, and that the way that these laws are being carried out is vastly unequal. That even though you're giving equal funds to schools, which oftentimes they weren't, but as long as you could say that you were giving equal funds to schools, then that was enough. What Brown versus Board of Education finds is that those funds are so mismanaged, and that the level of education that's in black schools versus white schools was so vastly different, that the only way to guarantee equality was to bring everyone together. But Plessy versus Ferguson will be the law of the land for almost 60 years. Opposing Booker T. Washington was W.E.B. Du Bois. His movement was known as the Niagara Movement, and his movement demands an immediate end to segregation, and W.E.B. Du Bois also puts forward this idea of the talented tenth. What he says is that what African Americans need to do in order to truly be equal is they need to stop relying on white society. They should not become white middle class, because they are not white middle class. They are a separate society in themselves. There's no reason to get rid of black culture. The way you do this is you train the talented tenth with the best possible education that you could. This idea of a classical education, learning languages, learning history, learning all of those educated things that the upper classes of white society knew. And then once you have an upper class of black society, then they can bring up the rest. And so that talented tenth could be used in order to bring up the rest of African American society until we truly had equality. And so demanded equal opportunity not only economically but also educationally. And this Niagara movement of Du Bois becomes the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This happens in 1909 after the Springfield race riots, and it was a number of different whites and blacks getting together in order to promote racial equality. They adopted a lot of the ideas and goals of the Niagara movement, and so the NAACP was originally meant to bring forward equality in terms of education, to make sure that blacks could go to colleges, but also they used lawsuits in courts quite a bit in order to guarantee equal treatment in society. They did a lot of research on racial injustice, and they have a very famous journal called Crisis, but it was to use the courts in order to bring about equality, and the NAACP is still around today. While Booker T. Washington and Du Bois were in conflict in public, they do have the same goals. They want racial equality. The means of getting there is what was different between the two men. Du Bois wants that classical education, and Booker T. Washington wants economic equality first, so that then later generations can pay for college and then have educational equality later on.